Hey everybody, so I wanted to do some reviews on some thermal optics, but it became pretty obvious that I needed to do a little primer on thermals and show you some tips and basics first. So today I'll be bringing you a beginner's guide to thermal optics, where we go over thermals and how it all works in the light spectrum. And hopefully by the end you understand some of the strengths and weaknesses of thermal, so then you can use it to your advantage. All right though, let's get started. So first off, we've talked about a lot of scopes and gear, and we've even dabbled into some different tiers of night vision. But I want you to remember that I'm not some level 100 wizard. And if you expect everything I'm saying about what I've learned to be fact-checked by some retired SF dude, well, I'm gonna tell you right now, you probably shouldn't be using YouTube as your primary source of information. But moving back, I do want to say that I think the landscape for thermal has really already changed. And what's interesting is I see a lot of these other big YouTubers or other big people talking about thermal, and they kind of gloss over it, when in reality, a thermal at a really high level is pretty much a necessity at this point. And there are some new products out there like this Axion 2 XG35 LRF from Pulsar that make the entire product even easier to carry with you for super easy scanning of targets and ability to range find their distance to you. And you'll see that in a review soon, but I would be baffled if you didn't see basic law enforcement with some sort of small handheld like that XG35, just due to its feature set and that small form factor. Which may mean that some of you may be very interested in our thermal hide review, which I'll link to up here. I just want you to be aware that you will absolutely encounter thermal optics if you're dealing with any sort of near-peer adversary. And your knowledge and proficiency about thermals is really a requirement if you're going to deal with any part of that threat. But before we get too far into this beginner guide on thermals, I do want to say big thanks to Pulsar for providing us with all the thermal optics we'll be showing you. And as I've alluded to, I'm super excited to show you those. But before we can get into the reviews of thermal, we really need to get into the nuts and bolts of how thermal works. As thermal can be a very confusing element, as most people don't realize that heat is actually a wavelength of light. One neat way to demonstrate it is that you can see heat in a mirror and see your thermal reflection, but you can't see thermal through glass. This is because the wavelength of heat can't travel through the glass. So you can't see outside, but the wavelengths do bounce off metal and mirrored surfaces to cause heat reflections. And another good example of this is maybe you've stood in a position where you've had the reflection of the sun bouncing off a mirror onto you. And not only is it bright, but it's hot. And that's because the actual heat from the sun is bouncing off that glass or that mirror and then reflecting onto you. And then if you take that knowledge one step further, you can then see how cheap thermal blankets that everyone seems to love actually reflect heat instead of absorbing it. So wearing a thermal blanket is like wearing a huge mirror when looking through thermal optics. Yeah, it might hide you in certain angles, but when the right light hits it, you literally glow like the sun. So no. Thermal survival blankets are stupid for hiding from thermal optics when you have any sort of quality thermal. Now, you can take advantage of one of the weaknesses of thermal though, that is the actual image relativity. Now to show this, those of you that have seen thermal are probably familiar with the view of the multicolors of different shades. Each optic allows you to go through these different modes, and they all provide different advantages such as white hot and black hot, and allow you to pick different color modes to see a target more clearly in different environments. And I'll show you all the different modes in a second, just pay attention to the detail in the image for now. The biggest thing to remember is the thermal image is measuring the relative heat to the heat of all the other items in the window. If all the items in view are of relatively similar temperature, you see a large color variation across only a few degrees of difference. But add a super hot item like a person or hot rocks, and the camera adjustment is relative again, which causes the scale to change. So all the detail is lost in the smaller item as the range of color becomes much wider over a larger span of temperature. And understanding thermal relativity and how that works with the objects in view is just as important as actually using it. Now, the actual measurement to determine how sensitive that is, well, it's sometimes listed and sometimes hidden, and if it's hidden, it's probably trash. The value is called the NETD, or Noise Equivalent Temperature Difference. And this is the value of the thermal itself to be able to determine and actually add detail to the temperature of different objects in view, and it's usually expressed in millikelvin. Millikelvin? What are we doing here? Most of these people are here for belts. Now, I will show you the difference though, as here is one image with 60 and 80 NETD. The image on the left has a ton more detail, but both of these thermals are identical in all the specs except for NETD. Also be aware that 100 NETD is considered the industry standard, so you could get a device with way worse thermal detection than even these two images. Here is a good chart that gives you a nice reference for NETD values and kind of what you should be looking for. Now, I want you to be aware that a lot of companies don't share that NETD value, and I think that's done on purpose, which is kind of crappy. But there are a couple more values and different pieces of the actual thermal optics that you need to understand before you can run off and figure out what you need to buy and then purchase one. The main one you need to be smart on first is sensor resolution. Now, thermal cameras are back in the standard definition world and use a 640 by 480 sensor on the very best thermal cameras. And as you step down, you then have a 384 by 288 in most of the mid-range to lower tier thermals. And then you get even lower as you get to the cheap ones and get down to 160 by 120. Now, to understand what all this means, the sensor takes in data and then outputs an image. The image it outputs is at the maximum sensor resolution. So a 384 by 288 sensor will give that quality of image and then blow it up to whatever size the viewing window is. Kind of. There are some other small details that come into play like pixel density and all that, but this is just the basics, so just stay with me here. Think of the detail in terms of halves. The 384 by 288 will have half the detail, ish, of the 640 sensor, and the 160 sensor will have a quarter of the detail of the 640. And that's why sometimes you're gonna see some videos online where people are gonna say like, hey, look, with my thermal camera, you can hide from thermal, but the camera they're using has a quarter of the detail that mine has. So then when I do the same test, I look through it and I'm like, bro, you're right there, you're not hidden at all. So as that sensor image is getting blown up to the viewing window, don't get too tied up in the size or resolution of the viewing window, like what you're actually seeing on the LCD screen. Just make sure it's not smaller than the actual sensor. Because putting the best quality 640 by 480 sensor image on an HD OLED screen just upscales the image and fills in the missing blocks with algorithmic best guesses as to what should be there. It's called upscaling, and I'll be honest, I'm pretty sure you've seen it, maybe even on accident. It's what happens when you play a standard def movie or like a PlayStation 1 that can't do HD, but then you play it on your big ol' nice HD big screen. It still kind of looks like melted crap. So the viewing screen doesn't really matter because you're limited by the sensor resolution anyway. Now though, remember the NETD we mentioned earlier. This is super important because you could get a camera with a super good sensor, like it's a super high resolution image, but then has a crappy NETD value. That basically means you're gonna get a super crisp image, but then it can't make very much variation in color range at all. And I found this amazing website called ThermalBase that actually has these amazing stats on various thermals. Now, one in particular in this chart shows detection, recognition, and identification for various thermal optics. Here we'll load up the Pulsar model similar to what we have. I think this is the step-down 388 by whatever version, but it'll give us a good base. Here, I pay attention to the value of identification because that's the distance where I could even tell what the hell it is I'm looking at. And detection means like the first blip on there. It's not really super useful in a tactical environment. I really need to know what the identification range is so I can identify if the thing I'm looking at is a friend or foe or not. And just keep an eye on these stats as we talk. Rabbit ID at 50 meters, person at 170 meters, and vehicle at 428 meters. Now let's shift over to one I've always wanted to see. This guy right here, the FLIR Breach. Now notice this is also a 380 by 288 sensor. So if you're like me, you're probably thinking same stuff, similar numbers, right? And this is where that NETD comes into play that no one shows you or talks about. Look at the stats on the FLIR Breach. This is almost unusable. Rabbit at 17 meters, human at 59 meters, vehicle at 143 meters. So the two optics actually have similar stats, but on the FLIR Breach, you have to be 50% closer to be even able to tell what you're even looking at. And I kind of think of this value right here, the NETD, is kind of like FOM for night vision. It's not the end-all be-all, but it kind of shows you what you're going to get in the end. Like for instance, we can look at this ridiculous clip-on with the Pulsar Krypton XG50 with its 640 sensor. Look at these numbers. 93 meters for a rabbit, an astounding 323 meters for a human, and vehicle ID at 789 meters. And what's nice is that these stats actually give you something measurable and something you can understand when you're actually out there shopping for thermals. As by looking at these, it's easy to see that the FXG has twice the ID recognition range of the Pulsar XG38 and an astounding 5.5 times more range than the FLIR Breach. So that's resolution and NETD, and as I review thermals, I'll make sure to show you all the details of each of the optics, and I'll make sure to use the DRI stats from ThermalBase as we go forward when I show you each of those optics in review. Now, one more thing we should mention is that some thermals have adjustable zoom and or adjustable focus. So pay attention to this also, as you may get a fixed 2x with a focus locked at infinity. This wouldn't be particularly useful, and I'd be willing to bet you'd be pretty annoyed to realize you can't see anything even remotely up close. And those different features really kind of play into what you can do with each type of thermal optic. And here we can kind of slip over and talk a little bit about how you can actually exploit the technology if you understand the different pieces like we talked about with relativity in the optic, and how you can actually beat thermal without actually using any sort of thermal blankets or anything like that. And you can do this by knowing that more dense items such as rocks and roads retain heat for a longer period of time, and often stay super hot even throughout the night. By picking a position near a road or hot rocks, you can hide your body shape and the detail loss from the surrounding items. This can be very situationally dependent though, so don't necessarily rely on this all the time, and anyone with half a brain that's out there scouting is probably gonna go check out all those hot rocks anyway, and whatever random other thing they may find. So being right up against some hot rocks is probably still gonna draw some attention to you. But the relative heat reading of the actual thermal optic can be used against it if you know how to weaponize it. Now, there are a couple different schemes, like color schemes and different way it reads, that I want to go over with you. Now, each brand has a few color schemes that are specific to each model or maker, so pay attention to this on the model you're looking for if you want a particular color scheme. Now, we'll start with white hot because I think all scopes have that one. Here the display becomes two-tone as white and black with all of the hot objects in white. And this color scheme is particularly useful if you're scanning for hot objects in a cooler environment. And white hot is super popular because that two-tone image can make a more budget-friendly sensor look a whole lot better than some of the other color schemes may do. The next one I'll show you is black hot. This makes all the hot items on the screen dark black. This is useful when the environment may be hotter than the actual target you're scanning for. Like if it's a super hot day or you're near some hot rocks, the black hot would be preferred because then the environment would be black and the actual body or animal you're looking for would then show up white again. Moving to the next color scheme though, the next one is particularly great and is called red hot. This is a nice mix where it uses the same two color scheme of white hot, but adds red to any target that is just way hotter than the rest. This is extremely useful for scanning an area to have animals or living objects just pop out at you. And then you're not trying to like sort out a shape like you are in white hot or black hot. It just pops out red and you know exactly where it is. It's pretty awesome. Moving on though, here is red monochrome. This uses red and white as the hottest. This is similar to white and black hot, but gives you a different contrast in color to give a different image contrast. I'll also mention violet and sepia here also, just to show those two split at the same time. They're the same thing really, and just use different contrast and colors to help you see better. And those three are really just a personal preference, I guess. I don't know. My preference is, I don't use any of those. Next, we have the more colorful one that you may be more familiar with, and this is called rainbow. Now, this one and the next one are my favorites for when I want to see color difference very clearly. For tactical use, red hot is probably better, but instead of different shades of white and black in white hot, I have totally different colors. This makes identifying hot and cold areas or warm trees and wildlife a lot easier for my eyes to sort out and tell the difference. Now, there is also the color scheme of ultramarine, which seems to just be rainbow but with a blue tint. This just results in all of your greens being gone and ends up with what I feel like is a loss in overall thermal fidelity. Ultramarine kinda looks better, but there's actually a whole lot less information happening there. Now, there's a couple more super small things I want to cover with you, and that's actually thermal calibration and thermal battery life. Now, the thermal sensor we mentioned earlier doesn't heat up uniformly, so the sensor itself has to be periodically reset. This can be done manually or automatically depending on the model, but here I'll show you what happens if you fail to calibrate it regularly. The image just slowly distorts into this total mess. And the interval between calibration can depend on what you're looking at and how active you are in scanning around. So yeah, thermal optic calibration is a thing, and it's something you have to be aware of because the actual thermal is inoperable for a couple seconds, and that can be super tricky when it has to calibrate every 15 seconds or less. But let's talk about one last kind of Achilles heel for all of thermal, and that's the batteries. Thermal optics chew up a ton of power. Where your night vision setup may last 30 hours, the battery pack in a thermal is probably a tenth of that, maybe less. Most handhelds can last 4 to 5 hours of continual use, but items like our FLIR Breach we mentioned earlier has a battery life of a whopping 1.5 hours on a CR123A battery. So good news, that means you only need about 8 batteries for a shift. Now, I just want to drive this home because it really means that you're not going to be able to use thermal optics the same way you use your night vision optics. Now, some thermals do offer battery packs that can hot swap rechargeable batteries. And as battery power will be an issue, I recommend you look for these as you're shopping. All right, well, I think that's a good solid base on thermal. We'll expand on it more as we do some more reviews, but at least now I don't have to repeat myself 100 times. But I hope this video on the basics of thermal was useful in your purchasing decisions. I want to say thanks to all of our Patreon supporters and all of our YouTube members. You guys make it all possible that we have thermal and I can even do these videos and show it off to you. And I want to say thanks to everyone that likes, comments, and subscribes. Comment down below what thermal you'd like me to check out for you. All right, everyone, Walsh out. Yeah, I'm just trying to talk to anybody that's special forces that can, say it's okay for me to talk on YouTube. Yeah, I know that's stupid. I know. So you got anybody?